Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Holly Antel, and this is the fourth lecture, I believe. Um, yes, my fourth lecture in the medical theory of psychology. This is a novel theory I have developed in order to give a formal, uh, falsifiable format to psychology in order to do health baseline based so creating health baselines and deviations from health baselines as a basis for diagnostics within psychology. Psychology, as it's currently practiced today, diagnostics are done using the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, currently in its fifth edition. DSM-5 is what it's colloquially known as. And the number one problem with that is that it never establishes a health baseline. So it doesn't say that this is a model of healthy behavior. There are no models of healthy behavior within the DSM-5. There are only models of unhealthy behavior. And that unhealthy behavior is determined by provider opinion based on reported stuff from the patient. My system, by contrast, is a surveying that is done either by the patient themselves or by the provider while observing the patient's information. And it has health baselines by which deviations indicate certain pathologies, illnesses, or occurrences of maladaptive or destructive behavior. Um, and so it really tries to bring a medical basis to the field of psychology, which deploys a lot of medicine, but it is not a medicine in and of itself. It's not a qualified science because a lot of opinion is interwoven into the practice without clear statistical and replicable methodologies. The methodologies I propose in my medical theory of psychology are completely replicable so that they can be used across the world by any provider and provide the same results across the board, which is how standard medicine is done. And my medical theory of psychology attempts to use that as a model for building this in accordance to mental health. It takes some concepts from traditional psychology and psychiatry and adds different nuances or clarifications for definitions, as we'll see in this video. So I will start sharing my screen. So the medical theory of psychology proposes categorical survey diagnostics, um, which determine whether or not a condition is present and the severity of that condition when a condition is present. It's also a cool little logic tool and two-step survey process, which classifies human behavior and creates health baselines for mental health so that deviations can be measured and statistically quantified. Um, As this is my fourth lecture, it's just a brief overview of the medical theory. This video is specifically about specific applications of medical theory of psychology and pleasure development, autism, and forensic psychology, how pleasure development relates to pathologies of like the serial killer profile to people with autism and a disorder I believe I identified called pleasure development disorder. Um, and before I do that, I did add something to my overall medical theory of psychology, which was I defined the ego. So ego is talked about a lot in psychology. I will bring up the page that I added. So the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, they define the ego as a conscious sense of self and all subsequent psychological phenomena relating to the self that comprises the individual's values, attitudes, and concerns. And then in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory, which is Freud's theory, it refers to a practical component of the personality that deals with the demands of the external world. How I define ego is a little bit different than either the APA or with Freud and psychoanalytic theory. Um, to me, the ego is the part of yourself that cares about what other people think. And it's that part, it's a kind of a filter that how you want to be perceived by others how that influences your behavior. That's the ego. That influence of how you want to be perceived by others and your behavior is your ego, or like how you want to project an image of yourself onto other people. To me, that's what I defined as the ego. It relates to identity. So, what the APA defines as the ego, I would use that to define identity. So, ego is an aspect of our identity, and how our personality and behaviors play out. Ego interplays with that in some fundamental way. Um, like for me, my ego, I want to be perceived as like someone who's very talented in psychology, very talented in math. I want to be perceived as like a scientist or a good teacher or a good communicator. I care about my self-image in those ways. I want to be seen as professional, academic, smart, credible. Those things I care about a lot of that when it comes to my image. Also being very authentic and integritous. So I'm very true to myself. And for example, identify as a narcissist by my own medical theory of psychology. I posit the four cluster B disorders represent kind of the bulk of neuroses in the human population, and that they can be viewed much differently than how they're currently characterized. I characterize them both as personality types as well as personality disorders. So I identify as having the narcissistic personality type rather than narcissistic personality disorder, which is its own thing. Um, but so I simply define that as being an independent extrovert at its most simple. I reduce things to a lot of binary variables in order to qualify phenomena as happening. Um, and so um, with narcissists, it's independent extrovert versus antisocial, which is independent introvert. Um, but there are differences in characteristics in narcissism, such as like selective empathy, like people with narcissistic personality. Uh, they're not, void of all empathy, they're selectively empathetic. And we all are to a degree, but narcissists or narcissist personality type might be more aware of it. Um, like you kind of use the trolley problem paradox. If I have to, if the house is on fire and I have to choose between, my sister's party guests or rescuing my nephew, I would definitely rescue my nephew. I have selective empathy. That's an extreme situation, which I hopefully never have to encounter, but we all have selective empathy to a degree. And so that's what I think people get confused with narcissists, think they have no empathy, but it's that they have very selective empathy. Um, and the more you can broaden that selection is healthier for narcissistic types, of course. But it recognizes that there are and should be limits to who you have empathy towards. Um, and like in terms of survival, like I outline, kind of the foremost basic ethical principles are like ensuring your own survival is the first principle, and then like do unto others is the second moral principle. If we can reduce moralities to kind of like the golden rule, I would add on to the golden rule that ensuring your own survival is of first ethical priority. And that's not commonly understood as an ethical priority, but I think it is, and I think that really changes how you would then, do unto others once you have your safety and security needs met. Um, within Maslow's hierarchy. So it's like when those are met, then it's do unto others. So that kind of ethical framework promotes like self-defense, and stuff like that. And so, when it comes to our survival and the survival of our loved ones, stuff like that, like we obviously have hierarchies and rankings where we place people, those around us, and where we place our own importance within those groups and stuff like that. Where again, hopefully these, dangerous situations don't arise or anything like that. But in the case that they do, we ultimately make decisions based on, personal preferences and selective empathy and stuff like that. Um, everyone wants to pretend to love everyone equally, but that's just not the case. Talk about prisoners or criminal populations. People seem to really not care for them very much, and that comes out very quickly. Um, so being aware of empathy selectiveness and like where you place empathy and stuff like that, I think is a good thing to have. And in narcissists, I think they're exceptionally aware of, who they care for or who they don't care for. Which can be is perceived in certain ways by other people. Um, but the ego, going back to that, is like I'm a narcissist, so it'd be like, of course I care about my ego, I care what others think of me, stuff like that. I care about my image that I put out there. So it's kind of like a kind of like that stereotype about narcissists that it actually does have some basis about being a little bit egotistical. Um, I care very much about my presentation and how I am perceived by others. And I definitely have an image of myself that I have of myself that I want to accurately portray to others. So I would say that I have a healthy, a stable ego, because what I want to portray to others is true to my authentic nature. Um, you know, narcissists get a bad rap and stuff like that, and I'm trying to like redefine what that word means and what those personality types are. Um, so if I cared too much about what other people think, I wouldn't, identify as that and try to redefine it, and change perceptions and stuff like that. Um, so consider myself having a very stable ego, but that is just an important concept that I added to my medical theory, that plays into the topic I'm discussing today, which is pleasure development, autism, serial killers too, and applications in forensic psychology. Definitely want to keep this video YouTube safe, so I'm not going to go into anything too graphic. But I think pleasure development, I have a very different opinion than Freud and what people in classic psychology believe, so it kind of disputes that. But I think I propose a good framework for what pleasure development may actually look like and pathologies related to that, occurring later in life. Um, and so I chose this picture of the delicious looking treats to show that like I think pleasure develops when we first develop a taste. So this is where I depart from psychoanalysis and Freudian theory, where he thinks pleasure is first experienced in the oral stage, with sucking and feeding and teething and stuff like that. Um, he sees it as pleasure seeking when baby perform those behaviors. I don't see it as pleasure seeking. I see it as relief seeking instead. There's the pressure to eat and through being hungry, um, pressure to expel waste, um, and just the building and releasing of pressure is that kind of like ebbing and flowing. Um, we can understand a lot of phenomena in the human experience as like fundamental variables like uh, pressure buildup and then pressure release, for example, um, is something that, pressure changes are intrinsic to like atmospheric sciences and stuff like that. And they can also be found in, cognitive science and psychology, which is really cool. Um, But like, 'cause another thing is I'm a nail biter. I've always been a nail biter. I have healthy teeth and healthy nails, so I'm not too worried about it. But I do bite my nails, so I do enjoy the kind of, and I'll play with my nail and my teeth. I know it sounds really gross. I hate to give too much information, TMI. But I've always enjoyed biting my nails. I use it to kind of like keep like floss and stuff like that. I use my nails to floss. I know it's gross. My apologies. But and like putting it between my teeth, like I apply pressure and then like I pull it out or I clean my teeth and just like release pressure. Like I get why that's kind of like a fun thing. It can be enjoyable to build up pressure and to relieve it. But the sensation of doing that is distinct from pleasure. Um, Pleasure I think is a little bit harder to pin down in terms of like, what it involves. Like where there's buildup of pressure and then release of pressure is the opposite of buildup of pressure. Um, and so for pleasure, it's kind of like, sobriety is kind of the best thing I could put it on. Like, what is pleasure the opposite of? And it's just, sobriety, normalness, neutral is what I would peg it as its opposite instead of pleasure and pain being opposite. Let's say pleasure and sobriety are opposite. Um, but I would say that pain is also an opposite of like neutrality. Um, but pain and pleasure are different opposites of neutrality. And then pressure and release can be either better or worse than neutrality in both instances. Like it's generally not a bad thing to urinate. It doesn't, healthy, if you're healthy, it doesn't feel bad. It's not necessarily like it can be annoying uh having to, make out time for that during your day, but for the most part, the experience itself isn't bad and stuff like that. So, um, it can arguably feel good. And so that's a pressure buildup and a pressure release that is feels good the whole time. Um, as long as your body is healthy and stuff like that, or at least doesn't feel bad. Um, so, and then there's also different forms of pressure and release that like, feel kind of bad, but maybe the release feels really good. Like putting pressure on my gums, that's kind of painful. So it's kind of negative, but it feels really good to like have that pressure release. Or like it feels really good to get a back massage, even though it really hurts to get that knot out, like applying the pressure and then like having it like relax and release, especially with like pressure point therapy and stuff like that. That feels really good. So I end up labeling uh it's like I'm making a little art project over here. um I'm trying to figure out different ways to like illustrate concepts. Um I label gratification as like part of that like pressure release. Um, it's like, the example of like urinating, put it in here. Feels good to urinate after drinking iced coffee on a road trip, like get in that bathroom. Like that's a great release. It sucks waiting with that pressure buildup, so that can even feel like a negative. But gratification is pleasure associated with buildup and release of pressure. Um, and so gratification includes pleasure, but it's also about like pressure buildup and pressure release. Whereas satisfaction is just a facet of pleasure, where it's just like feeling good. It's like you're having really fun creating activity. Like when I create these, I have a lot of fun and I'm really into it. So I'm really zoned in. I'm in the flow. I'm very satisfied with the work I'm doing. It's not necessarily relieving pressure. Um, so I call that satisfaction. And then gratification is pleasure, but because you're relieving pressure or building up pressure and then relieving it. Um, but so where Freud thinks babies are getting pleasure from like breastfeeding or like teething and stuff like that. I don't think they're getting pleasure. I think they're relieving the pressure of hunger, or the pressure of like painful gums. Um, and that pleasure is introduced until they like have taste variety. So they're eating more adult foods and they start developing taste for different foods to start enjoying eating food more than like nursing, which is bland and takes up, the mother's autonomy and stuff like that. So it's like when they really start enjoying foods more than milk. And like taste is where that pleasure comes in. Because taste is kind of entirely pleasurable. I mean, not all taste, not all taste. Um, but taste for the most part is entirely pleasurable experience for taste something that you like. For example, this is a little Kool-Aid drink I mixed. Um, it's like 80% sugar-free Kool-Aid, like 20% real sugar Kool-Aid. Well, mocktail I make for myself. And it tastes really good. And the taste of it is just all pleasure. If I'm really thirsty, it's less about that satisfying taste. Or if I'm talking a lot, I need a drink, so it's like it's gratifying. So it's both like pleasurable because it's, taste itself is just pure pleasure, but like I'm also satiating a thirst and a need because I'm using my voice to like wet my whistle. um, but so I think pleasure isn't an immediate thing that we discover in life. It's not as immediate. It's just like pressure release, kind of like taking care of our own, figuring out how to mitigate our own forms of like suffering and pressure. Um, And that taste is really when pleasure is introduced. Um, so that's kind of, I'm pretty confident in my idea here, but classic psychology says pleasure is developed during that oral stage. I don't think so. I think it's more when it's about food. It's not developed during nursing. It's developed after leaving nursing. Um, in my theory. And so healthy people experience both pleasure and gratification. So you can experience pleasure from the pressure and release aspects of life, but also like pleasure as a state in of itself, not because anything is changing, not because you're like getting relieved of a pressure or pain, but because like it's just an enjoyable state to be in. Um, Being drunk is pleasurable for some people. It's just you enjoy your mood, you enjoy the people you're with, you enjoy what you're doing and stuff like that. Um, or smoking a little pot, people enjoy these things. Um, and it's because they're in a state of pleasure. Uh, and because I put the absent pleasure sobriety, even intoxicated states can count too. And they can tend to be really pleasurable, which is one reason why I think people that have problems with pleasure development or what I call pleasure development disorder, entheogens might be a great modality of healing, considering they affect and bring neurogenesis to like dopaminergic pathways and stuff like that. Um, It'd be really useful because I think that there is a problem with unhealthy pleasure development and the lack of pleasure development. I think people are experiencing other things instead of pleasure, but are mistaking those things for pleasure. And I think like people who don't experience pleasure don't realize that they're not experiencing pleasure. And then people who experience pleasure don't realize that perhaps a large portion of the population doesn't experience pleasure. Um, so uh, I think this theory could bring a lot of awareness to something that's really going on. Um, and I also think that like it can develop in kind of behavioral pathologies from stuff like autism, which there's been recent news saying that Tylenol um, is a reason for autism, just like they've said vaccines. Well, I haven't looked at that research. I can't say either way if it's sound or not. I haven't looked at it. Um, but I do think I'm kind of outlining an environmental factor for autism and a feature of autism. So with pleasure development disorder, it's where basically ex the child never has pleasurable experiences. And so the dopamine reward pathways never develop. So it's like they can't self-reference anything for a good time, is what happens when it comes to pleasure development disorder. So, pardon me. Um, and so they're deprived of natural pleasure development, and so those neural pathways just never form, and so they don't experience pleasure later in life. Is my theory. I call it pleasure development disorder. Um, and this can happen from extreme situations such as abuse, where because they're neglected and often starving. It doesn't matter what something tastes like, they just need to get fed. And so they don't really develop an appreciation for taste and stuff like that. They just focus on the pressure to eat and the release of pressure of eating and getting full. So that kind of like that axis of like suffering to not suffering or from pressure to no pressure. Um, Instead of deriving any pleasure out of the experience because it's so paramount to their survival, that pleasure just kind of sat from it, which really sucks. It's really sad. Um, so I think this is really common in like serial killer pathologies, or serial killer profiles, because a lot of serial killers they tend to have abusive or abnormal childhoods. Um, and so because they're constantly in survival mode and stuff like that, they don't gain appreciation for taste, and because they don't have neglectful parents. Um, so I start that the first thing that develops is the physical, which is taste, and then emotional, which is by like activity variation and like interaction with other people and stuff like that. And that to develop emotional pleasure, you have to first develop physical pleasure, is another one of my theories. Um, and so you develop taste, and then you start maturing, becoming more aware of your environment, other people in it, and that you're an independent agent, other people are independent agents, stuff like that, and what interaction is, and you start interacting different things. And so through doing that, you start experiencing emotional pleasure, like um, helping your parents with chores around the house, stuff like that. Might not be the best activity, but then like coloring in a coloring book afterwards might be really pleasurable compared to like, doing chores. But chores aren't that bad, but they're like necessary for survival and stuff like that. Um, Coloring a coloring book and then eating will be really pleasurable. And then like that variation of activity, some of those things end up being more pleasurable than others. And that's how they develop like passions, interests, and pleasure out of like different, situations within an emotional context during childhood development. And so if someone is neglected physically, causing disruptions in taste and that kind of physical pleasure development, it easily follows that they're not going to have a lot of interaction variation, activity variation throughout their childhood to where find a lot of pleasure in their activities throughout the day. So that both the emotional and the physical pleasure signals are not going to just, they have nothing to self-reference back to. They just don't develop, um, early in childhood development, and then later in life, that shows up as an ability to feel pleasure and to only or to understand pleasure as a release of high pressure to no pressure, or the release of suffering to no suffering. So the transitions from those states are seen as pleasure instead of pleasure being a state of itself. So it's like the state of high pressure to the state of no pressure. That transition is where the pleasure is. Whereas pleasure is also a state like no pressure and high pressure is. Um, so that's where the problem is. So for me personally, I do feel pleasure. I don't have problems with feeling pleasure. I enjoy my fair share of entheogen drugs, stuff like that. But I definitely experience pleasure, forms of like gratitude, satisfaction. There's many different ways. I need to ruminate on how to really categorize pleasure, but I definitely do experience it. But I'm definitely noticing that I think there's a problem people who lack it in the general population. Um, and like I've had friends myself who like I would like, I've had friends that like will talk to me about like, kind of their behaviors and stuff like that. I've always been known as like really good at like psychology and intuitive about other people and stuff like that. So a friend of mine, he would tell me that like, he has very anhedonic responses to stuff. Like he went skydiving and it was just like fine with him. It was like whatever. It wasn't like, didn't give him much of anything. That's how most things in life were towards him. And we've talked a lot about that, and I would label that as anhedonic, but now I'm like wondering um, if that would point to something like pleasure development disorder. Um, and so, I don't like being too intrusive on friends and stuff like that. I don't want them to, or family, or let them think that I'm like experimenting on them. But like one thing I would be able to bring up my theory in conversation and be like, do you enjoy eating? Or is it just kind of like you have to do it? I'm very curious about that. Um, and about pleasure development disorder. So, I also think like in looking at not really research, but just kind of observing like behavior and autism and stuff like that. Um, I think that, autism spectrum disorders, like sometimes when it comes to these kinds of cognitive disorders, it's just like there's just something different about how reality is perceived, it seems fundamentally. Um, And I think one of those fundamental differences could be a lack of being able to feel pleasure or misattributing pleasure to the transition from pressure to no pressure. Um, so I think that's definitely possible um, within autistic populations. And this is a question that can be surveyed both with like questions um, and also to see if there's like a biological indication in terms of like neural imaging or other things that indicate um, pleasure development disorder. I wonder how their reward systems light up in terms of when they describe that they're feeling pleasure, what's actually happening. Um, just kind of like my speculation on pleasure development disorder is like what also happens is that they like were losing a pet would be super severe to someone. It would be very severe to me. My worst experience ever. Um, and the severe suffering compared to like losing a game if I'm really invested in it, or if I have money, if it's a gambling game and I have money on it, it's going to be a little below that neutral, a little bit of suffering, but it's not going to be as devastating as that. Um, Whereas people with pleasure development disorder, uh, these things could all be equally devastating in terms of suffering, um, or equally painful in terms of suffering. And then it's the relief of that pressure feeling hungry goes back to the neutral feeling the pressure is gone. So it's like they're relieving that neutral pressure. Um, so I think people who have PDD seek ways to build and relieve pressure as ways of pursuing pleasure. Um, and I'm sure these populations still seek and achieve orgasm, as that is definitely a gratification. There is a significant pressure buildup and release of pressure in the arc of the orgasm. Um, so those who have PDD wouldn't have any differences, I believe, in terms of like masturbation or sexual activity, or they might seek it more often if any deviations were to occur. But I don't think it's PDD is not the same as like erectile dysfunction, um, or anything like that. They can still get aroused and, you know, have the orgasm process, but it's just not as like it's more of a pressure until the actual orgasm happens instead of a pleasure until the orgasm happens. Uh, but it could be like a more enjoyable pressure than other pressure, but it's not like a pleasure. Um, because those pathways aren't being utilized in the brain. But research has been done to identify whether or not this disorder exists, and then what trends and patterns are in relation to it in terms of correlation with autism, serial killers, I think, and also I think anhedonia or other kinds of neurocognitive disorders. Um, So autism is highly debated on what causes it, but what is not highly debated is that it's becoming an increasing occurrence within the human population. A lot more people are autistic these days than were decades ago, or even just a few years ago. I think one of the biggest factors to this is environmentally. I can't speak for it yet in terms of like genetics or biologically, but environmentally, I think one of the biggest contributing factors is screens. So you have computers, televisions, tablets, and phones. Um, and they're often, all four are often used throughout the day in terms of activity, especially when schools move more towards like online and stuff like that. Um, and so the variation of activity during the day becomes, devices rather than like physical interaction, helping out parents with chores, stuff like that. It just becomes all day, all devices. And I think people are getting like cognitively desensitized to pleasure as well as other things. I think this is contributing, or maybe pleasure development disorder, maybe because of the modern technology and stuff like that. Um, or it definitely has an environmental factor making it happen with these things. Um, so I think that a lack of variety in activity during childhood development and that activity being primarily on different types of devices throughout the day um, is having negative consequences in the human population. I think can contribute to pleasure development disorder. Um, and those children not developing the dopamine reward pathways that produce pleasure later in life. So they just misattribute pleasure to the buildup of pressure and then it's released. Um, and I've seen this, I play the RuPaul's Drag Race game. It's a really fun game. I haven't hit a paywall yet, and I'm on like level 52 or 53. Um, but it's really fun, like sim game, simulate being a drag queen. Uh, and you watch ads to game stuff in the game, which is fun because I don't want to pay. Uh, but it's a cool game based off RuPaul's Drag Race. And in that game, I see a lot of ads for different games. And I see a lot of trends in these different games I'm getting advertised for. One of them is King Shot. And I see ads for this game all the time. And it's basically you control a little guy that you move around that's like constantly like shooting or collecting resources and you point them in the direction of where the enemies are coming from. When an enemy dies, you can loot them for coins, and then coins you can build up defenses, and the enemies keep growing and growing and growing. You keep shooting and shooting, build up defenses, and do this and do that and do this and do that, and then like finally you start overcoming them, you conquer, you complete the level. And so I just see this pattern of like pressure building up in the gameplay. So like in the RuPaul game, it's not really much. You can be very lazy about playing it. You don't have to pay attention to it that hard. But in games like King Shot, you have to pay like super severe attention to it. And like um the pressure keeps building. Or like for oh gosh, what is it, Royal Clash, where you have to like match things to a certain timer or else like the king gets, perished in a snake pit or something like that. But it's like high pressure with it, complete an objective before the time is up, or you lose, or you win. And like, you know, whether you win or lose, the pressure is relieved because the level is over at the end of the time. But the build up of pressure and then the win, it's probably uh, a better release of pressure than a loss. Um, and so I'm just seeing this trend of where it's like the gameplay is really all about pressure to complete an objective and a pressure that continues to build and build and build and build until it's over. And so it's just this pressure release phenomenon. And it's like these games are advertised as being tons of fun and fun for hours and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, people are saying that's fun, huh? They're saying that is fun. Fun to me applies pleasure. What's going on here? So I was thinking about that and it's like, yeah, it's really about, pressure and release. And it's probably really appealing to these populations who feel who their highest understanding of pleasure is build up pressure and release. So it's appealing to those populations. I think we should treat those populations instead to be able to feel the full range of pleasure and see if we can get neural pathways developed into properly feeling pleasure. I think that would be the healthier solution rather than like feeding into the compulsion to build pressure and release it as like, you know, something better than just kind of like boring or neutral or suffering or whatever. Um, so I created a survey to try to capture whether presence of pleasure development disorder. Um, So the first question is, do you enjoy eating and drinking and derive pleasure and enjoyment from eating alone? Or do you only eat because it is necessary and find that food is more often tolerable or not rather than enjoyable? Um, and so I put non-psychoactive food and drink because like people will drink for the purpose of getting drunk rather than the pleasure of it for the most part. I'm not a huge fan of the taste of alcohol. I've definitely become acclimated to it in adulthood, but I'm not a huge fan of the taste. Um, but yeah, I love eating and drinking. I'm a food lover. I love eating. It's so good. So I would test here. And then can you describe most readers generally with full different types of activity that produce different types of rewarding physical and emotional experiences? Or do your days lack this type of experience and feeling variety? Um, I do rewarding, try to do as much rewarding things throughout my day as possible. So I would normally score there. I get anhedonia sometimes. So if that was the case, I might score in the PDD one. So I put the possible indication of anhedonia there. Um, because that could be uh some mild depression or anhedonia going on. Um, so this is where it's the physical pleasure is not present. And so this is where I said this is where there's more of a major deviant behavior risk because it's saying emotional pleasure is present. So they're finding a lot of ways, and it could be innocuous, like playing games like King Shot, where they found ways to have that a different variety of pressure and release. Um, but they could also be doing more deviant things, especially if we're talking the more the serial killer profile types and the like autistic types. Um, and then so I would probably rate autistic types would probably score PDD-3 here. So slight risk of like getting addicted to a pressure release something that's like not good. Um, there is that chance, but for the most part, people on the autism spectrum, um, they're not serial killers. Uh, but I would think that they don't really, let's say they probably, if I'm right on this, they probably would be like, yeah, I don't think I experience pleasure like it's supposed to be experienced. Um, so could easily answer no to both of these. Or I might be able to like reframe this question a little bit better. Um, but so it's like basically the answer yes here. They found a way to compensate for that. And is that way a deviant way or not? Like I said, it could be innocuous, like a bunch of different video games, but it could be something a little more sinister. Um, and then over here, this could, this might not even be BPDD. It could just be depression. Depends on if it's been there, if it's, been present their entire life, or if it's only been like a recent onset, or if it goes back and forth. Um, if it goes back and forth between the two, I would say that's anhedonia and not PDD. If it's always been this way throughout most of their life or most life that they can remember, then that's PDD. But if it's gone back and forth, then that's going to be anhedonia rather than PDD. Whereas the scoring on this side really quantifies someone having PDD or pleasure development disorder. So I'm gonna put where PDD1 can be anhedonia or PDD and anhedonia. Um, I might add in there a qualifier that has been there their whole life. It's PDD. If it goes back and forth, it's anhedonia. Um, so here's where it gets more to the forensic and like serial killer profile stuff. Um, the picture of Jason isn't loading. Um, so in serial killers, I think that like, when they're capturing a victim and they are, setting them up for whatever they plan on doing to, there's the picture, whatever they plan on doing to the victim, um, they're building up a pressure of like, will they get caught? Will the victim overpower them and kill them? Will the victim overpower them and go, call the cops and stuff like that? So while they're involving themselves with the victim, whether it's stalking the victim, because the more they stalk the victim, the more they build up the pressure to then do it, investment cost, sunk cost fallacy or whatever. And then as they're interacting with the victim, um, pressure builds on whether or not, they can finish a job or whatever. And then they do their thing, it relieves the pressure. The victim's no longer a liability necessarily. The body might be, or the crime scene might be, but the victim no longer is. But then the body, the crime scene creates another pressure thing that they, you know, either clean up after themselves and move along or do whatever to like, or they just flee and go completely under the radar, whatever it is to relieve that pressure. So it's like these cycles of building up pressure and then release, pressure and release. Um, and I would say that like this ends up building into like a profile to where they become so insecure in their ability to survive unless they're able to keep killing. So because they've like been killing their whole lives, and if, I feel like they have this like fallacy reasoning where they think that the longer they go without killing, the more likely they will be of getting caught. So long as they're able to keep killing, keep going about their, murderous rampages, they have a less likelihood of getting caught. Um, I just developed a logic model for fallacy reasoning in a different portfolio that could apply to this. And it's the faux justification heuristic. So that's what like a serial killer would do, is like they would justify that they need to keep killing. So if they don't keep killing, they're not going to be able to keep evading police or keep dominating police, or, have that apex predator position, if they keep their title or something like that. I really do think it comes down to that kind of like thinking on some level. Um, and I don't think like typical serial killers, they experience pleasure. They just get a total like a huge pressure. They build up an unimaginable pressure with what they're doing, and then the release of that is unimaginable. The act that they're committing. Uh, so they go to this very extreme of pressure buildup and release in order to get feeling of, what they consider gratification or pleasure. Um, and I'd also think that like their ego is very important to them. And as I said before, your ego is like the frame of reference or filter that you use that is like how you want to be seen by others. And it's like when they're in a situation with their victim, they want to be seen by that victim in a certain ways, either like they want to be seen as like a god or like a devil, um, or like as, a powerful kind of like force or entity or person. Um, and then they want to be seen as like smart or clever or another kind of like intelligence trait by like the cops or the public or stuff like that. They want to be feared by either the cops or the public. Um, but how they want to look based on their killings would be a discussion of their ego, um, which I think might be like ripe for interpretation in terms of profiling serial killers. Um, and like so like in ego development, you learn by like how people treat you and like what the world is, stuff like that. Like here is what my possible, you know, personas can be. Here are the possibilities for what my personality or image or whatever can be like towards other. You learn about possibilities through just like your environment and interactions like that growing up. And it's like when serial killers are doing their thing, they create very steep limitations on how they're going to be viewed by others, because like no matter what, they are seen as killers and, depraved and going against nature and stuff like that. So it's like they have these like stark limitations for how they can possibly be viewed because of their behavior. And so like that will ultimately influence how they want to be like they can only be perceived in so many ways that are usually negative. So it's like their ego projection is based off of those big limitations they create through themselves. Uh, because people are going to think about one thing when they think about them. And so they really limit how their ego can be perceived or how they can be perceived as a whole person. They really reduce other people's capability of seeing them as a whole person. By doing that, they really limit that ego to be seen as like less than human or like depraved and stuff like that. Um, and so like my psychology methods, they can be really used to like formalize existing kind of sets and strategies. So, like in forensic psychology, there's, really smart forensic psychologists out there who have their own methods of determining like what a crime scene says about um, the criminal and, trying to identify suspects and, they're pretty committed, hopefully, to getting the right suspect convicted for the crime. And so, it would be great for me to like work with an expert in forensic psychology and just being like, all right, what do you look for? Let's see how we can make categorical so we can like make it um like a almost checklist or if or um because you can make like kind of one or the other determinations when doing criminal profiling or crime scene investigation. Um like this I created better survey sus score, a sample idea. I really like to work with someone in forensic psychology to do this, but like um, these are just example ways of how you could kind of formalize a logic that goes behind, um, the justice system and, whether someone is guilty or innocent and, forensics and what goes into, proving culpability and guilt and stuff like that. Um, I would love to work in like law or ethics, stuff like that, to develop systems for like, when are these situations, black and white and binary, can be categorized as one thing or another? And then how do we combine those variables to like really get, discrete results every time and replicable results and stuff like that so that like everyone has the same system applied to them. It's not up to like lawyer interpretation or judge and jury interpretation. It's the same system applied to everyone. Just like my medical theory, psychology, making it like medicine, like it's the same diagnostic criteria for everyone, the same process. It's just used across the board. Law should be treated in the same way. Um, and it's not. There's lots of problems with the US justice system. I could go on, I won't. Uh, but this is just a way that an example way of like kind of quantifying those if and either or scenarios with crime scene investigation and criminal profiling that can give results and indications as like, meaningful occurrences and information happening within a case. And so um, this question's like, was the suspect either the last person seen with the victim or when the suspect was last seen with the victim, was that interaction hostile? I would say those, if either of those are true, that is significant. So I place it as the X variable. And then does assess if any no relationship to the victim. Um, and just quickly defining what any relationship is in terms of like criminal investigations. That's why I would like define what would be like, what would constitute a relationship, what we work looking into. Versus if there is some kind of like relationship involved, because there's relationship involved that involves that they know personal details about someone, where they work, what time they go for lunch, stuff like that. So the more you know someone, the more you know about them and can be a threat to them in situations of crime. So this is just victim association assess. That was funny. It's like this type of profiling, and then proximity association. So can establish an alibi with hard evidence, such as security footage or phone GPS data. Which I don't know. So I know they can like use phone GPS data against you, but I don't know how often you're like allowed to use it as part of your defense. I wonder how often that's used. So like, can't check my phone. I wasn't there. No, that's what I would uh immediately say if I was accused of something I didn't do. Like, I have my phone on me. Check it up. Check it out. Um, so I don't I've never been in a situation where I could do that as a defense, but I'm sure it could happen. So, is there a strong alibi that can be backed up with hard evidence? Um, the hard evidence gets a little bit murky nowadays with deepfake and stuff like that. So, definite forensic um, thresholds and safeguards determining whether or not like footage is real or faked would definitely need to be established. Um, and then is a suspect known to live, work, visit, otherwise frequent the area within 30 miles of the crime scene or the victim's home? Um, I just think questions like these kind of capture whether or not it makes sense that someone was uh, possibly at a crime scene during the time the crime occurred. Um, but it'd be really cool to kind of apply this two-step logic reasoning um, and work with people in forensic psychology um, to develop like formalized methods that could be used to like do some reform in the justice system. I think that'd be really cool. Um, I'm all about bringing more ethics and morality into our legal system. Um, Ironically, I think it lacks a lot of it, but that can be changed. Constitution is fluid for a reason. Um, we have amendments and changes and stuff like that all the time, so progress is slow, but it doesn't have to be. But methods like these can really streamline things so that progress can be fast. Just why I really like this new methodology of organizing formal logic in terms of um, categorizing and other types of quantification, statistics, stuff like that. Um, but I'm just going over everything to make sure I talk about everything I wanted to in this video. This just talks about how I might need to edit this because he talks about pleasure stages of development. So this is all about pleasure, um, which I no longer think it's about pleasure. I think it's about pressure and release, um, which is what we learned before we learn what pleasure is. So I think that will do it for this video at least. I'm going to try to get the energy to record my next one, which is about heuristics, decision making, and behavioral psychology. Economic behavioral psychology, which is really cool. Um, but thank you so much for tuning in. Um, and joining me on my journey of exploring the medical theory of psychology. I really hope to bring this into academia or into active research sometime very soon. I'm definitely seeking research opportunities, either in the private, government, or academic sectors. I know with the shutdown right now, times are tough, as well as funding discrepancies in the current political zeitgeist. So donations are also appreciated at my Cash App. My cash tag is Coffee Crow 420. Thank you so much for watching uh, and for learning about the medical theory of psychology with me. Thank you.